Yeah, okay, that's my cue to get started. So if everyone could just put your name and contact information and just into chat, and welcome to our Time to Act substance use session. So we are recording this echo session for education and quality improvement purposes. So if you are participating, you're consenting to be recorded. And if you do not wish to be recorded, you can just disconnect from the call. So Echo is an interactive community, so we ask that you like turn your cameras on and try to participate when we're having discussions. We will have breakout rooms at the end, and that's just a good opportunity to discuss the case presentation and learn a little bit more. We do ask that you protect individual privacy by avoiding using people's first, middle, or last name. We ask that you don't identify family members, coworkers, email addresses, and if you have any other questions about de-identifying information, you can reach out to a hub member. Our hub members should have an asterisk in front of their name, so that's how you can identify them. So we'll start with a didactic speaker, which will be Abigail Mack. And we will then move on to our case presentation and recommendations. And then just throughout the session, you will just have an opportunity for professional networking, either through the chat or just through coming off mute and having discussions. We do ask that you rename your profile, as I said before. If you change it to your first and last name, your state, your job title, and your organization, that will just help with that professional networking. You can also use the raise your hand feature if you have a question throughout the presentation, and we will call attention to your question so you can ask that. And then as far as pre-registering, if you're interested in pre-registering for our sessions, just email projectscope@usu.edu. And then credit for attendance. We do ask that you fill out our survey, which we'll be dropping in throughout the session. And then in about a month, we'll send you your certificate of attendance. So we use Canvas to store all of our session recordings, materials, case presentations, and just PowerPoints, just so you guys can have access to that before and after the sessions. If you're interested in joining our Canvas page, once again, email the project scope email. And then case studies. So at the end of the session, we'll have a case study. This shares information about real life situations and helps you hear from your colleagues about recommendations. So we highly recommend, if you have a case you're struggling with or you would like advice on, a case presentation is a really good way to get that advice. And then these are our social media platforms. If you're not already following us, please take a moment and follow us. We usually post session updates and then just past materials and a lot of good information. So yeah. And I'm just going to turn the time over to Abigail Mack so she can start a didactic presentation.
Here we go. Okay, great. So I just want to say first to begin, I'm really excited to be here today and to be in conversation with everyone that's a part of Project Scope. I think what's happening here is really exciting. And I love the opportunity to connect with people outside of my little social scientist realm. So I'm a medical anthropologist. I do my research in Los Angeles and Central Appalachia. And I am most often speaking to rooms of, I do speak to clinicians a lot in more one-on-one interactions. In the past, I've given presentations, but it's been a while since I've done a didactic. And I'm curious if, for those of you who haven't, if you want to share, right, where you're coming from in the chat, like what your professional focus is, right? I'll do my best to try to make sure that I'm not teaching you the obvious and giving you a presentation that will hopefully be thought-provoking and maybe even helpful. So I'll just keep an eye on that chat as I go. Okay, right. So I'm a professor of anthropology at Weber State University. And today I'm just going to spend a little bit of time walking you through some of the research that I've been doing with a small team over the course of the past, now we're going on 6 years. And we have been working in Central Appalachia with to study people who are in recovery. Right? I'll get into greater details with that in a little bit. Today I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to present 3 case studies to work through some of our initial findings from the research, and I'm going to end with a little bit of a kind of philosophical reflection on some of the ways we're working out ideas around codependence, interdependence, things like that. So I have been doing my research on mental health care and substance use disorders since 2014. My previous work was in Los Angeles, where I was working in psychiatric emergency services, and I was conducting research with clinicians and police officers, patients, patient advocates, their family members, to better understand how people were making ethical caregiving decisions in emergency situations, right? So when they had to treat people against their will. Later on, I was hired as a postdoc researcher to do field work in Central Appalachia with a team of people who are interested in a comparative study of faith-based and clinical approaches to recovery from substance use disorder. So I bring a linguistic anthropology lens to my work. I'm really paying attention closely to the language that people are using as they're interacting with patients. And I'm doing that in order to provide insights into how people can better meet the needs of the people that they're working with, right? So, all kinds of problems. So in Los Angeles, this is translated into a number of projects with the Department of Public Health and the Department of Mental Health. In 2016, we did a study with the jail system, looking at how a diversion program was or wasn't effectively moving people out of emergency crisis care and into more consistent outpatient care. I've also worked with outreach workers in Los Angeles who are trying to provide services to people in states of serious psychiatric distress who are also unhoused, right? So how do you work with people who maybe have intense medical vulnerabilities? How do you connect them into a complicated bureaucracy? And I'm continuing to do that work in LA, but I'm also now got my fingers in another set of pies. So in Tennessee, where I do my work with our Hoping and Coping team, we are seeking to address a pretty complicated situation. So as many people know, Appalachia has been a statistical center of the opioid epidemic for a long time. In 2021, the Appalachian Regional Commission gathered data that suggested that rates of mortality by overdose were 72% higher than the rest of the nation. And there has been a lot of popular depictions of, right, the situation in Appalachia. So we were facing a complicated situation, right? Appalachia has been highlighted as a result of the Purdue Pharma cases, as a result of books and television shows like Dope Sick, as the central space. And it's also a place where we've developed an already kind of established prejudice around, or stereotype of what it looks like to be living in Appalachia, to be struggling with substance use disorder in Appalachia, right? So our goals were to get on the ground and talk to people and find out what was really going on. with an eye towards providing government organizations, right? We're funded by the National Science Foundation, and local regional groups with insights into how to better treat opioid use disorder. And then the pandemic happened. So on top of all of that, we also were doing this research on the ground in the midst of lockdown, and a variety of other circumstances began to come into play. How does telehealth influence the way that a person accesses care? What is the lockdown doing to people's mental health? It's a lot of complicated situations on the ground. And we are really wanting to get more insights into, right, what's beyond the statistics, right? Beyond just the stereotypes, beyond just those overwhelming numbers, 72% higher mortality rate by overdose. So our research team is China Schurz. She's now at the University of Notre Dame, was previously at UVA where the postdoc was housed. She has been doing her work primarily in Uganda, and she just published a book I'll talk about briefly called Higher Powers on recovery from alcohol use disorder in Uganda, from a cross-cultural perspective, and also looking again at that faith-based form of recovery program versus a clinical program. Josh Burroway is now doing more corporate research, previously at UVA, and his work before he started working in Appalachia was with people who injected opioids and were unhoused in London. On top of that, our research team also includes the many people who helped us on the ground, who participated in our research, who sat down for interviews, who allowed me to shadow them through their day at the clinic, and in particular, 20 people who let us do more person-centered, close focal follows over the course of 4 years, right? So we really spent time with those group of people, really trying to understand their experiences. And when we started the research, we had some core questions, right? How do people conceive of sobriety, recovery, wellness? How do they talk about it? What language do they use, right? How is it similar or different from national conversations on substance use disorder, right? How do they maintain sobriety after initial detox and treatment? And if not sobriety, right, what does that recovery look like? Right. And following up on China's work in Uganda and looking specifically at Appalachia, Central Appalachia, as that belt buckle of the Bible Belt, how critically different are these clinical and faith-based approaches to recovery? Are they mutually exclusive? So we're along those lines. When we were interacting with people, we're looking at how they integrate the information they learn in the clinic or in group into their everyday life. How do they understand, how are these approaches understood by their culture and their community, their family, right? How do these differences impact the way they access care, their long-term recovery potential, the relationships they have with themselves, their family and friends and broader community, and how do these models help or inhibit how a person imagines a good life for themselves, an alternative future, right? So when we're asking these questions, we're really trying to highlight and speak to, right, beyond just mere survival. What does a good life look like, and how do people achieve it? Right, and we're asking these from an anthropological perspective, which necessarily entails, right, something slightly different than a sociological perspective or a public health perspective, insofar as we're really focusing also on culture. So I have to jump out a little bit, right, to establish just some core definitions for us to work with. And I acknowledge this might be a little tedious for those of you who had to do cultural competence stuff on your MCAT or whatever, right? You could just take this as a fun review. But when I'm talking about culture here, I'm not talking about, big big obvious things, I'm looking at all of the ways that we share systems of ideas, right? Meanings, symbols, in order to coordinate social action, right? And culture from this perspective is really one of our species' greatest evolutionary traits. It's how we manage to pass information on and get things done. It's also, right, ends up making what looks really natural and seems like an obvious conclusion about a world or a space feel natural, right? But in fact, a lot of the way that our social world is organized is not natural. It is culturally informed. And from a medical anthropology perspective, right, we understand that like biomedicine is a culturally informed way of thinking about the world. It's different in different countries, in different states, in different parts of the state, how people practice it, right? And biomedical spaces really show us the ways that a culture can reproduce its own beliefs and ideals and values. In this case, around health and wellness, right? But then you add to this, right, an additional institution of religion that makes this a really useful space to begin comparing or making apparent, right, what is cultural about a biomedical approach to substance use disorder, right? So the way that I really am drawn to focus on this is through language. And part of the reason I am drawn to focus on language is because bureaucratic language and form work was how I was really a part of my coming of age. I am a systems impacted researcher. I have two siblings who were incarcerated, one who died by suicide, both of whom struggled with substance use disorder. And I spent a lot of my time growing up navigating, labyrinths of bureaucratic form work and insurance policy in order to get them care. And that the differences in language between the forms I was filling out for a doctor versus a lawyer versus an insurance company really sparked my attention. What was getting left out? What were we missing? How were these forms working to kind of shape our interpretation of my family members? And I really became entranced by the shifts of medical language over time, right? I think that really shows us how our culture is changing and the way that relationships between clinicians and people seeking care is changing. So the way that I begin to think about language and culture working together is through a kind of controversial theory that was the feature of a film called Arrival. They call it the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, but what we're really talking about here is a theory of linguistic relativity. Right, so a bit of a tangent, but I hope you'll go with me on this. Right, so linguistic relativity really simply is the idea that all of our vocabularies and language practices are developed, in relationship to what we value as a culture, in relationship to our environment, right? And then in turn can inform how people see and engage the world, right? How they perceive the world. In this model, right, language and culture and thought, perception are really intimately linked. It's a kind of, it's useless to think which came first. It's a chicken and egg scenario, but all of these things are informing each other. When we think about how language is informing culture, which is informing the way that we perceive the world, then things like people first language movements really start to, the stakes of that really start to become clear. It's not just a matter of recognizing a person's basic humanity and treating them with dignity, right? It's a conceptual shift that people are making, right? We're not dealing with categories of people, prisoners, inmates, what have you. We are dealing with people who are incarcerated, in which case we're engaging people, right? And when we start to think about those conceptual shifts, we can begin to, and their impact, we can begin to elaborate a whole range of ways that culture is informing the ways we understand illness and disease. Some people are skeptical of this. And so one way I like to think about this is by looking at metaphor, right? Our entire language practice is metaphorical, right? It's everywhere. It's an intimate part of the way that we engage the world. Most language is metaphor because most language is talking about something that is abstract and not present. And so we have to rely on other ideas and concepts to make the abstract visible, right? And what we have found over time in anthropology, researchers have been investigating language and its relationship to thought for a long time, is that metaphor is a great space for elaborating this, right? Because its essence, right, is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another, right? So the way that we think about metaphor working is we take one conceptual source domain and we apply it to another domain, one that's more abstract. So we might take something like war and all the baggage that's entailed in war, right? The power dynamics, the risk to life, the potential for harm, and we bring that metaphor over into argument. Right. So George Lakoff really famously pointed out, it turns out, at least in American culture, we use argument as war metaphors all the time. Right. Your claim is indefensible. He attacked every weak point, right on target. Right. We have an idea that you can win an argument, right? That we have strategies, right? That we can shoot down arguments. All of these metaphors don't just help us talk about argumentation, they actually have material effects. And it turns out if you live in a culture that is using a lot of argument and war metaphors, you're more inclined to be passive aggressive, right? Because there's high stakes to conflict, right? We can do this again with time, right? And researchers have found, for instance, in a study that compared bilingual Swedish and Spanish speakers, that this, again, does change the way you see the world. So in Swedish, time is discussed usually using length metaphors. Whereas in Spanish, time is usually discussed using volume metaphors. In a study that was done recently, they had bilingual speakers watch a dot move across a screen and estimate how long it took for that dot to reach the end while speaking Swedish or while speaking Spanish. And then they were asked to watch a glass fill with water while speaking Spanish, while speaking English. If the speaker was speaking Swedish while they watched the line move, they were more accurate in their measurements of time than if they were speaking Spanish, and vice versa. It's a small study. It's one really kind of playful study in some ways, but it's a fun one to think about when we start thinking about how language influences us, right? And these kinds of, there've been a broad range of these kinds of studies that have continued to show that this is the case. So one of the ways that I began early on thinking about this as I was learning about how language impacted our thought was I began to ask, right, what source domains are we drawing on when we're talking about mental health? We're talking about addiction, right? In the case of addiction, right, coming from Latin, addicere, to deliver, to devote, to consecrate, to sacrifice, right? There's a lot of, right, there's a metaphor underlying that of worship in some ways. And this has been taken up really, really seriously by a lot of the people I work with in faith-based contexts, right? Metaphor is fantastic for engaging this, but more useful for us in the medical world, right, are the ways that these metaphors become incorporated into narrative, right? So Arthur Kleinman, one of our champion medical anthropologists and MD PhD, right, really outlines this in the 80s. And so a lot of this I know is familiar to you all, right? Illness, in his book, Illness Narratives, he explores the ways that metaphor place events in an order, right? He's also speaking to, my slide images are out of order, linguistic anthropologists like Eleanor Oakes, who looks at this from a language perspective, right? So anyway, narratives. they do a lot of things for us that are socially and culturally useful. They place events in an order, right? This is an often logical and chronological order, right? It casts people and places and events in relationship to each other, sometimes in ways that wouldn't always be the case naturally, right? It constructs and projects our cultural identity, right? We use it to establish a sense of cause and effect and moral and ethical obligation and valuation, right? When we are doing narrative, we are doing a lot. And importantly, one of the things that linguistic anthropologists highlight is this isn't just happening when we sit down and tell a story to each other over a cup of coffee, and it's not just happening in terms of monologue, right? We're always in conversation with many other people as we're beginning to build narratives to interpret and understand our world. This matters most, according to Arthur Kleinman, when it comes to the narratives we build around illness, right? So he elaborated this theory of explanatory models, which I often use these slides with my students, right, to explore some of the ways that narratives play out in prescription, in commercials for medication, right? These explanatory models, right, could be stories about or narratives about how an illness started or what caused it, right? You went outside and your hair was wet, so you got a cold, right? That could be an explanatory model of colds, right? The pathophysiological processes of an illness, right? What's it doing in the body, to the body, right? The course of the illness, its cure, if it has one, right? And when we look at these from multiple angles, right, it can help us really elaborate where there's points of conflict between clinicians, why a patient might not comply with medical direction, and what the social and cultural consequences of an illness or a diagnosis are beyond the clinic, right? Because these experiences don't just include the patient, right? And we can begin to outline some dynamics, right? We look at who's telling the story, who's granted the most authority, right? Whose actions or interventions are privileged in an explanatory model, right? Does this model tell the story of a disease where the only options are medical treatment? Or does this model tell the story of an illness where there's other options for a person, right? And what does this reflect about a culture and the way that they envision what an illness is? So perhaps some of this is a little bit of review. I just wanted to give a little bit of this because I think this becomes a space where we can really begin to see some of those initial questions that we had about our research emerge, right? So when China finished her work in Uganda, she was tasked with elaborating two different kind of approaches to alcohol use disorder in Uganda, the chronic relapsing brain disease biomedical model, and a model that was developing sort of on the ground in a Pentecostal church where her research team was also working. And it's helpful to note here as I talk about these explanatory models, right? These are the stereotypes of an explanatory model, right? These are not actually in practice what happens. As we'll see in the next couple of slides, in actual practice, people engage explanatory models in very different ways, right? So under the chronic relapsing brain disease model, as people are sort of, right, engaging it, we can see like some of the, where is it in the body? What is it doing to the brain, right? The receptors of the brain in particular, right? This model also relates substance use disorder to other habit forming functions of the brain, right? So it's telling us a story about what's happening in our body, where, why, how, right? And really emphasizes the chronic and relapsing. And as many people know, right, when this was introduced, the goal was to demoralize or otherwise destigmatize addiction, right? This isn't a problem of a moral failing. This is a natural result of how the brain works. This model kind of contrasts very nicely in stereotype when we look at other faith-based models, like a spiritual warfare model, in ways that help us to really effectively stereotype both biomedicine and faith-based care, right? So again, these aren't actually the way that people engage these models. These are surface level understandings, right? So in a spiritual warfare model of a Christian Pentecostal practitioner in Uganda, right, might locate addiction in the supernatural spiritual realm as an attack from a demonic outside force, right? And under this model, with the right interventions, the right spiritual interventions, a person could become totally free from addiction, delivered by God. This, like CRBD, does help us, help folks sort of demoralize addiction by removing some of the individual responsibility from it, right? It's not me, it was elsewhere. What actually happens in practice is that because very few patients or people are staying in just the clinic or just a faith-based group, is on the ground, people are playing out different qualified redemption models of their illness. So one person that I worked with, we call Deborah. Deborah has had, as of last February, so almost 17 years as of last February, 18 years of total sobriety, no relapse, after 15 years of habitual intravenous polysubstance use. Deborah has a very unique story of recovery to those of us who are outside the Bible Belt, but in fact, she is one of many people I met who was set free from their substance use disorder at a tent revival. In this case, what this meant was she was overcome by the Holy Spirit. She fell to the ground. She began speaking in tongues. She did this for 3 weeks at this tent revival. And by the end of it, she reported that she experienced no withdrawal and no cravings. And so part of me was very inclined to want to explore that, and I did. I had her tell me the story over and over again to try to understand what had happened there. But what became more interesting over time was trying to understand how this story was incorporated into the way Deborah maintains her sobriety, for 15 years. So previously she'd sought treatment at a methadone maintenance program, but after her deliverance, she began working with a faith-based recovery group, which she also attended and worked with for 15 years. As a result of her work there, right, and as a result of her experience, she at least partially rejects the CRBD model, right? And vehemently rejects AA models, right? When she's been asked to speak at AA, she says, "I am Deborah, I am not an addict," right? And her model over time of understanding how addiction works has become something that looks a lot more qualified than either of those stereotypes we have about clinical or faith-based explanatory models, right? So she understands that addiction can be the result of family trauma, which is also something she understands in terms of generational curses. This is language from her faith-based group. Addiction can be the result of poor individual life choices. It can also be the result of spiritual warfare. A person can be set free from God, but not always. And once set free, they have the obligation to do work because of their own human failings. So a lot of the work she ends up doing to treat the potential return of addiction looks a lot like the work that gets done in an AA space or a clinical group workspace, right? So a lot of CBT, somatic processing, a lot of identifying and naming emotions and how they operate for her in her body, right? At the end of the day, for her, drug use becomes something that is subordinate to a stronger relationship with God, and recovery is about that God relationship, right? That requires ongoing practice. So in an article that's forthcoming, I kind of talk a little bit more about how she uses this language from the faith-based group and the ways that that looks very similar to clinical language in order to pray in ways that look very similar to forms of meditation that people use in trauma-informed care, right? And she participates in worship that actually looks a lot like EMDR, right? So there's some interesting overlaps happening there. And it's worth thinking through. Deborah has some hangups in her explanatory model of addiction that that highlight some core issues for us before we started our research around the conflict between a clinical approach and a faith-based approach. This conflict is depicted really well in the Dope Sick TV show. One character is planning to go into treatment that would involve Suboxone and is advised against it from a pastor who says her reliance on Suboxone would be like idol worship, essentially. A lot of people do carry that or do hold that belief to some degree, but most of the people we worked with in faith-based spaces, like Deborah, were more suspicious of Suboxone because it is the product, another product by Big Pharma, right? After everything with Purdue and the rampant exploitation of vulnerable people by cash-based clinics, right? A lot of people, including Deborah, see that as something that is potentially damaging to their community. At the same time, she's also working to try to open her mind to the idea that this could be a step toward an ultimate reliance on God. Deborah's model looks slightly different than someone like Emily. I know I'm talking really fast. Please feel free to throw in questions. Emily has been seeking recovery from polysubstance use disorder for about 6 years. Like Deborah, she has injected both opioids and methamphetamines habitually during the course of her use. And when we met, she was working in a clinic where she was getting care in a clinic where the chronic relapsing brain disease model was really rampant. And we ended up spending a lot of time thinking and talking about this explanatory model. For her, the words chronic implied never ending, even though that maybe isn't what they mean in a medical world, right? Death really felt inevitable, right? She didn't really feel a sense of hope that she would recover and began to feel less invested in this form of care. Over time, she's engaged in kind of a recovery syncretism. So she's now uses MOED, right, medications for opioid use disorder, but is also heavily involved in faith-based groups and church meetings, right? And so her explanatory model of her addiction, right, embraces all of these things, right? So she rejects both the CRBD model and once an addict, always an addict descriptors, but recognizes that relapse can be a part of recovery and has oriented to her recovery as not something that has a final destination. It won't necessarily be something like Deborah's total freedom, but would be something she has to continue to practice if she can manage to engage her PTSD. While she will always have the potential of relapse, right? That part has remained for her. There is still this idea that, I guess I kind of contradicted myself there. There's still this idea that eventually someday God could grant that for her. And in the meantime, her freedom might look like something else. we're going to come back to Emily. But one of the things that looking at these models has done for us has begun to help us really elaborate how distinct or not a clinical or faith-based approach is, right? So again, while Deborah doesn't engage in the CRBD model, she uses a broad range of techniques that are developed in response to the CRBD model, right? And while Emily is kind of practicing developing an explanatory model of her own addiction that is in fluctuation as she's picking things from popular culture. She's really big on social media, right? While she's engaging online addiction recovery groups, faith-based addiction recovery groups, and treatment in clinic, is finding ways to use language that work for her, right? And has found frustratingly, sometimes frustrating moments, that she needs both a clinical and faith-based approach to do recovery well. Why does this matter? When we started this field work, so many people told us that there were irreconcilable differences between what was happening in clinic spaces in Appalachia and what was happening in faith-based groups. What we realize is, while that's true for maybe the doctors or pastors involved at a very, very surface level, right? Most people throughout Appalachia are moving through are encountering these models in a bunch of different ways and making them work for themselves. So there's potential space there for deeper more explicit collaboration between clinical and faith-based approaches to substance use disorder. We've also seen in the clinics where we work, some clinicians have begun to introduce people to the CRBD model without using the words chronic relapsing brain disease, and have found it to be a more effective way of preparing their clients for the potential of relapse without making it seem like an inevitability. We've had more people begin to reach out to faith-based groups and vice versa in collaboration. Part of the overall hope for a move like that would be that in the midst of all of this, we start filling in some gaps in care for those people who aren't quite making it work in a clinical space or aren't quite making it work in a faith-based space. Our work in the clinic around Suboxone has been published in a recent article for the American Ethnologist. A lot of people had questions about, right, Suboxone diversion, right, and medications for opioid use disorder as a potential social, emotional, and actual currency, right? Even before we got there, people were asking questions around that. And when we got onto the ground, we began to ask in the anthropological way, what does Suboxone symbolize to the people who use it? What does it symbolize to a clinician who's understanding addiction from a CRBD model, or a patient or their family who might see Suboxone as a product from a potentially, manipulative big pharma company, right? How are people relating to this in this community? And what we know already, right? People have been diverting Suboxone and other buprenorphine products to meet their needs, right? For a while. Now we want to know, well, why, how, what's the point of this? How should we understand this? And looking closely at the way people use Suboxone once they leave the clinic also reveals a lot of really important information to us about how families and networks of care, informal networks of care, are developed, at least in the spaces where we were working. So from this perspective, we have a case study of a relationship between Tripp and Sally Ann. So Tripp has been engaging in clinical intervention for a while. And at the time, about a year into the research with Tripp, she was prescribed 9 pills a week from her clinic. And she purchased additional Suboxone and other buprenorphine products as she needed them from people in her social network. Sally Ann, meanwhile, had spent 9 months in a methadone maintenance program and had successfully, 9 years, and had successfully weaned off of opioids before she was reintroduced when she took her sister to treatment. Her sister kind of kept insisting that she pay Sally Ann for the car rides by offering Suboxone. Sally Ann refused until one day it was just the right moment. After that, Sally Ann began to source her medication from Tripp and other family and community members, right? So we have 2 people, right? Tripp and her mother, they're both using Suboxone. They both access it in similar but slightly different ways, right? Tripp uses most of her Suboxone, but diverts 2 of her pills to her mother to cover her rent, and reports that she preferred injecting that Suboxone over taking the medication sublingually. Sally Ann, meanwhile, took the medication as directed, as far as I know. Josh was working more closely with these 2. But she consumed it in secret. She didn't want her husband to know, right? Her husband had a lot of stereotypes about opioid use, negative stereotypes, and Sally wanted to protect her marriage. So we have a case here that we could view as like a really standard case in some ways as far as Tripp's concerned of medical noncompliance. But from a cultural perspective, there's a lot more happening here, right? And we can begin to ask what's going on here, what's being achieved, and is something like giving your mother Suboxone, could that be considered a form of care? Right. So part of what we're doing when we're asking these questions is we're trying to break models that might explicitly or strictly criminalize this behavior, so that we can actually see and understand why people do what they're doing, right? So from one perspective, right, Tripp is engaging in a kind of harm reduction for her mother. She's preventing her mom from withdrawing, from getting medication that might be contaminated, right? She's helping her mother protect her marriage by keeping the Suboxone use secret, and perhaps keeping her mom from moving on to something like harder drugs. And if we look at all of this in relationship to the secrecy and care that is enveloping all of these secrecy and misdirection that's enveloping all these practices, then we might also start to think about, right, what this tells us about the way that vulnerable populations, people who are dealing with economic scarcity, successfully navigate or not, right, all of the demands that they face, right? How do they protect fragile networks? How do they protect legal status? How do they maintain social status? Angela Garcia has done fantastic work on this front, right? Families sharing medications or drugs, and family care networks in New Mexico, and I really recommend her incredible work, right? When we started to elaborate this in our research and the ways that it was playing out for Tripp and Sally Ann, right, we also began to elaborate, right, some clinical care decisions that could be made in response, right? So one response from a clinician to learning that Tripp is diverting some of her medication for her mother might be to increase pharmaceutical surveillance, right? Depending on how disciplinarian or authoritarian they are, they may, eventually involve other groups. But what happened with Tripp was fascinating. she shifted to a new clinic. And when she joined that clinic, she shared with her clinician that she was diverting 2 pills to her mother, 2 pills a week to her mother. His response was to bring the mother in for treatment, right? So, and he continues to do that, right? So knowing what's going on with his patients at a cultural level, right? Knowing that these kin networks are important, that when people can't make money, they find creative ways of meeting their needs. He also goes out into the parking lot and pulls in anybody who's sitting in the parking lots waiting for others to join them in treatment, right? So people giving rides, the way that Sally Ann did to her sister, right? Others who are maybe hoping to get access to Suboxone, right? So rather than surveil and police and discipline, the clinician in this case is embracing that network and using it to expand out care, right? So that everyone has the amount of medication they need to successfully achieve the form of recovery they want to achieve, right? So we're beginning to elaborate how culture is shifting around surveilling medications in Central Appalachia, which is also a space where medication surveillance is really intense because of the opioid epidemic. The last case study I'll present to you all is one that really was what really has provoked a lot of questions for us, and is really a space where we're getting a little bit more philosophical. As we've been working with people in recovery, we're also working with all of their family members and interviewing and following them. And a lot of the standard models for conceptualizing healthy relationships in recovery emerged again and again, right? How do we navigate codependence? How do we navigate something like compassion fatigue? How do we navigate abandonment or not enabling someone, right? And when are these things culturally and socially acceptable, morally acceptable, right? And how do these terms conceptualize relationships, right? So on the one hand, codependence conceptualizes a very unhealthy relationship, while compassion fatigue conceptualizes a very hierarchical relationship. Only the people who have power and access to resources get the compassion fatigue, right? So in this last bit, and this will be I'm sorry, I know I didn't leave a lot of time for questions. I was really nervous, so I over-prepared. I'll just leave this, some thoughts on Emily. So Emily has attended approximately 25 treatment programs since we began our research, and has struggled with relapse throughout our research project. In addition to, so we have accounts, many accounts of Emily's relapse, but where this began or started to become interesting in terms of codependence was around a relationship she developed with a woman called Pastor Ann. Pastor Ann was someone who was very maternal, motherly, charismatic Christian, leader of a church, not leading any kind of addiction recovery. It wasn't even on her radar until Emily overdosed in the church's parking lot, and Pastor Ann revived her. Emily overdosed several more times in front of Pastor Ann, and each time she was revived. But in the last relapse that Emily had, Ann exploded. Emily said, right, it scared her to death. She thought I was dead. And then when I showed back up, it was like she was a totally different person. She didn't want to talk to me unless I went to treatment. Her face went cold, right? She Emily felt she stopped looking at her the same way. And Emily began to feel really resentful because this felt like a violation of the Christian compassion that everyone had been preaching. But at the same time, she also really saw how worried Pastor Ann was. And in this moment began to realize that Ann was just as homesick, what a phrase that Emily uses, as Emily was for the prospect of becoming well. Emily kept using this word homesick, and it showed up in so many like social media posts and other areas of our field work that we had to follow this line through. What we are beginning to think about is how might a word like homesick, beyond just being clever wordplay, give us language for, right, those really euphoric highs and nauseating lows that people experience when they're caring for someone in recovery, right? Or they're seeking recovery themselves, right? So how do people really navigate a hope for a future and disappointment without without totally breaking down? Our goal here, we hope, is that this describes the pain of striving for something better in your life, right? That it can operate alongside those personal and traumatic events that drive people to use, right? Homesickness is also happening alongside trauma, and that it can describe that disappointment, rage we feel when yet another obstacle to recovery emerges, right? The loss of a job, a car, housing, an arrest that leads into incarceration or probationary oversight, a change in medical insurance policies, all of these things that will restrict access to care. Hope sickness emerges in those moments of denial, right? We also hope it describes, that grief that people have right before they abandon someone or enact a boundary, right? And we think it may structure some of the emotional, material, and physical boundaries that people draw once they finally draw them in their relationships with each other during recovery. More importantly, we want to engage hope sickness as a space where we might successfully avoid a hermeneutic of suspicion that would cast either Emily's relapse or someone like Pastor Ann's rage as moral failings, or as that might cast Emily, for instance, as manipulative when she went to recovery for the 20th time, as if she didn't believe or truly hope that she would get that recovery. And part of the way that we're operationalizing this is by looking at people who have successfully drawn these boundaries around hope. So another mother figure in Emily's life is a psychologist named Riley Owens. She's also a religious leader. And she, over our time of knowing her, we've known her for 5 years, about the same time that we've known Emily. She's told this story of her early work in recovery care. Someone she had been working with had relapsed, and she spent all day driving the streets of the city where she lived, sobbing, searching for him. She missed her daughter's bridal shower. She was so caught up in that hope-sick search for this other person, this person who was in the midst of a relapse. And that moment shifted for her, and she began to rely instead on this, over time, on the Christian theology that she practices, which is a Baptist Calvinist tradition of predestination. God's in control. We could see something like that as like, okay, God's in control, I'm just going to ignore it. But Riley then uses this to correct herself when she starts to feel homesick for people. I have a vision here of what I think your wellness looks like, and I am trapping you with it. But what I need to do is open up the possibility that there's something else out there for you, and I don't know what that is. So with people that she works with who have the potential for relapse, she's shifted away from saying, don't do this, don't do that, to what sounds like a cynical, don't die. And while Emily at first found that offensive, or might have, she understood it to mean keep going, keep living, because there's a future, a hope for you, right? More than anything else, this hope sickness, this idea of elaborating this, we hope helps people shift out of moments that might be pathologized as unhealthy, right? Or pathologized as codependent or compassion fatigue, and recognize themselves instead in a space of more horizontal and reciprocal relationships, right? Hope sickness, right? We are all invested in people's care, right? Maybe we can
move on to this
suspicion
slide
by making it clear that any decision a person makes about treatment or use is never as clean as tidy as we think it is, right? And hopefully we can begin to elaborate those moments when our own hope for a better future become untenable, and find more useful ways of moving through hope in a space of resilience. I apologize again for going a little too long. Thank you so much for letting me talk this out with you. It is an early study, so we're still elaborating our findings, but I really am grateful for this space and opportunity. So just thank you.
Abby, that was such a great presentation. There is a question in here that just says, based on your research, what a, oh, now I lost it since we moved. You stopped sharing. I was like, oh, it went. Okay. Clinical versus faith-based has proven to be more effective in an area where religious odyssey is ingrained in a culture of, or in the culture of a population, or do you feel like it could be more effective to incorporate and intermingle a clinical approach with a faith-based one? I should not have read that out loud.
Oh, that's okay. It's a really good question. On the one hand, like a faith-based approach can maybe respond more directly in some ways to the cultural practices and language practices that are already there on the ground, especially in a Bible Belt space like Central Appalachia. But there's a little bit more nuance, that's needed in both cases, in both clinical and faith-based cases, right? So on the faith end of the spectrum, right, people, right, Deborah's case, 17 years of sobriety after 15 years of methamphetamine and opioid use is remarkable. And it looks like the work that she's been doing has been really effective. But on the other hand, like in a case like Emily's, there have been several moments where the faith-based programming she's interfaced with didn't have the medical expertise or resources to help her safely navigate something like detox or the often crushing depression that can come after you detox from methamphetamine in particular. So what it looks like to us, at least, and we still have a good 400 hours of interview data to analyze, at least from this initial part, is that what needs to happen is more collaboration, conversation, and engagement between clinical and faith-based models of recovery care. Yeah, we need more of that. Thank you for that question.
So do we have any more questions while Abby's still here? I know you also have to teach soon, so we won't hold you for too long. But I did want, actually, do you, I wanted to ask a little bit more about compassion fatigue and like what exactly that like will look like and what it means a little bit, because I've just never heard that term before.
Okay, thank you. So compassion fatigue is language that's been used more recently in social working and medical care spaces around to describe a particular kind of burnout that happens for caregivers, right? You are exposed to someone suffering so long, right? You start to withdraw, you become exhausted. It looks a lot like burnout, right? And the idea is that we should name this so that we can help clinicians recognize when it's happening so that they can take a step back and then hopefully return to care with more effectively with energy. I think that over time, both our research team has become a little bit skeptical about the utility of compassion fatigue, mostly because we're looking beyond the clinic. We're looking at like interactions that aren't necessarily as strictly hierarchical as a doctor and a patient interaction might be. And we also wanted to highlight something that was a little bit more reciprocal about the interactions that happened between a person who's seeking recovery and a person who is offering care, right? That there is an interdependence that emerges it can veer on unhealthy, but it isn't always the case. It's pretty natural human experience to respond to disappointment in the ways that the people we work with respond. So you're trying to open that up, think a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, actually. I feel like it's really important to like think about the mental health of the providers when dealing with difficult situations like that. So I think that's really awesome.
I think for me personally, hope sickness has become a really useful tool as I navigate my own family dynamics.
Yeah.
When to recognize, like when I'm really upset with my brother when he's had a relapse, right? The ways that like my hope sick response might be preventing me from seeing him, his needs, and his idea of what a future looks like. So it's been really helpful for me in terms of really better connecting with the people I take care of, which is why I was hopeful about introducing it here. I know I talked a lot and I threw a lot of stuff at you all. I hope that it was still really interesting. And if you'd like to ask more questions or reach out, I'm just going to throw my email address here. And I hope to hear from some folks. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you all in other sessions later this year.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for presenting.
All right.
So at this point, we're probably just going to forego our case presentation until next month because we just had such an interesting discussion afterwards. So yeah, our next session will be in October, and if you follow our social media pages or our website, you can see the topic that we'll be announcing. So thank you, everyone.